Now, you've probably seen those clips of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to the Oval Office. It ended in disaster, and the fallout came quickly with the Trump administration's decision to suspend all military aid to Ukraine. Now, that meeting at the White House definitely going to be in history books as a moment of monumental change in the United States' role on the world stage. Without the Americans, how bad do things now look for Ukraine? Could the Europeans step in to make up for the lost support? This week on To The Point, we're looking at the consequences of Donald Trump putting U.S. military aid to Ukraine on hold. How could Europe help fill the gap? Hello and welcome. I'm Claire Richardson in Berlin, and I'm so delighted to welcome our panel with military and political expertise to discuss this topic. We have Sarah Pagung, Director of the International Politics Program at the Körber Foundation. Carlo Masala, a military expert and professor for international politics at the Bundeswehr University Munich. And joining us today from New York, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, a former commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. So, Carlo, let's start with the immediate fallout from that Trump-Zelenskyy meeting. How quickly might we see changes on the battlefield in Ukraine following the suspension of U.S. military aid?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between potential changes we might see on the front line, and I think this will take time. I mean, the Ukrainians so far are still well equipped with ammunition, but within 2 or 3 months, if the Europeans are not able to step in, we will see some changes probably at the front line. The more dramatic thing is, according to me, is the lack of air defense. If the U.S. stops delivering Patriot missiles for the Patriot batteries, we might see more success in ballistic missile strikes by the Russians. And the really dramatic thing for both is the lack of reconnaissance and surveillance data, so which Ukrainians need. First of all, to hit very precisely Russian positions. Secondly, also to have an early warning system when ballistic missiles are coming in, when fighter jets are getting up in Russia. This might turn into a pretty dramatic disaster in the following weeks, depending on how long this stop will last.
So a whole host of challenges there. Ben, when you hear what Carlo has said there, do you think that Putin is sitting in Moscow cheering this on?
Well, I have to say first that what happened Friday in the Oval Office was probably the worst day of my life, at least in the last 10 years. Professionally, it was embarrassing. I felt terrible for President Zelensky. And then I look at this as a gigantic strategic mistake for the United States because the situation on the battlefield is not as bad as is generally described in a lot of different media sources. And Europe is clearly waking up, and I think we're going to see Europeans working together with Ukraine to not only stop Russia, but actually to get to a much better situation, and they're going to do that without the U.S. and despite the U.S., and that's going to mean lost influence and lost credibility from our country. So I thought Friday was a terrible strategic mistake for the United States. Yeah. I do agree, of course, with Carlo that the thing I worry most about is the shutting off of intelligence for Ukraine by the United States. So this makes it much more difficult for them to be able to counter Russian missile strikes.
Ben, could the Europeans step in to bridge some of the divide there? We've heard today France offering to share its intelligence with Ukraine.
I think that they can do an awful lot. I mean, the United States is not the only country that has certain kind of assets. And frankly, most intelligence professionals don't advertise what they are able to do. So I suspect allies are going to do a lot of things that will not be talked about, shouldn't be talked about. There is, in fact, a lot more capability out there.
Yeah. Now, Sarah, there is also The question over all of this after the Zelensky-Trump meeting of whether this is a permanent shift in U.S. foreign policy or whether, as some suspect, this is a bargaining tactic from Trump trying to bring Zelensky to the table to sign this minerals deal on terms that Trump wants. Do you see it as a more permanent shift?
I see it as a more permanent shift because what we see now is that Moscow, as well as Washington, pursue a strategy of normalization of their relationship. And that's, I think, a fundamental change of the U.S. strategy. Having that said, of course, what we see between Trump and Zelensky in the recent weeks is a strategy of really coercing and forcing Zelensky to the negotiation table, because if Trump wants his deal with Putin, and he already announced one, he needs one, and he wants one, he needs Zelensky to bow down. And I think the pressure we have seen rhetorically in the last weeks and now also in practice with pausing military supply, also with pausing sharing of intelligence, is exactly this, trying to get Zelensky to the negotiation table.
And so regardless of the motivations, after that meeting, the Trump administration did move very quickly to suspend all military aid to Ukraine. And it's a move that many U.S. allies and Ukrainians see as blackmail.
Along the front line, the fighting continues. But Ukrainian soldiers know their situation is only going to get worse without U.S. military aid. One thing I know for sure is that without support, it will be hard. Not just hard, but very hard. Meanwhile, at the White House, U.S. President Trump has put Ukrainian President Zelensky under immense pressure to strike a deal.
If somebody doesn't want to make a deal, I think that person won't be around very long. That person will not be listened to very long. Because I believe that Russia wants to make a deal. I believe certainly the people of Ukraine want to make a deal.
Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, the US government under Joe Biden supported Ukraine with military and financial aid, an estimated $120 billion. It's unlikely that Western countries will be able to match that. US military aid seems irreplaceable, especially when it comes to the US Patriot air defense system. Is Ukraine fighting a losing battle without US support?
We'll pass that question right on to Sarah. Can you put into perspective for us how important U.S. military support has been for Ukraine?
It has been tremendously important, especially as the U.S. can supply capabilities that Europeans can't. However, if you take a look at the bigger picture, I think Europe should step up, and I think Europe will be able to step up and to supply. I think the best strategy for now would be to talk to the Americans, and that's what especially Macron and Starmer are doing, to achieve that the U.S. at least for some time comes back, because I think it's illusional to believe that the U.S. will come back as we have seen for the last 10, 20, 30 years forever, but to really, get a transition phase, and by that, to buy time for the Europeans to step up their military game. But we also have to acknowledge that there will be a gap in defense capabilities for Ukraine and in security for Europe. But how big this gap will be really depends on what the Europeans are going to do now.
Well, let's talk about that in more detail. Carlo, can you tell me about the Patriot systems in greater detail? Is there a comparable replacement that the Europeans could offer?
Well, yeah, there is. I mean, there is IRIS-T, for example, and if you remember that Keir Starmer basically promised 2.5 billion euros, something like that, for Ukraine, when most of the money will be spent on interceptors for for air defense. So there is an alternative. The point is, we need to be very quick and we need to step up the game very rapidly, because otherwise there is this gap on the ground which works not in favor of Ukraine. So it's a question of time now, of time and action we take as Europeans. And then we're able not fully to be able to replace the US as a provider of material, but to a great extent to basically help Ukraine just with European ammunition, European interceptors, and so on and so forth. So there is a possibility, but it's a question of time.
Yeah, Ben, can you pick up on what Carlo's been saying? What else is the U.S. providing the Ukrainians that would be difficult for the Europeans to replace quickly?
Well, I think it is worth noting that Europe actually provides more than the United States does in terms of overall aid and equipment. So it's not like we're starting from zero. I have been impressed with the rapidity with which the German Bundestag and the incoming government, once it's formed, to change the law to allow increased spending and the emphasis coming from Herr Merz. I think this is the kind of energy that political leaders have to show that can have the timing that Carlo is talking about. But I also think we should not think of terms of replacing platform for platform. If the U.S. provides this thing, then somebody else has to come up with a different thing to replace it. It's more about capability. And giving the Ukrainians the ability to defend themselves from air and missile attacks, whatever the systems are. I would also say, about 50, I learned this from the EU, about 50% of the ammunition that is already produced in Europe actually goes to customers in Africa and the Middle East. And so I think this is a place where governments could demonstrate will by redirecting priorities, figuring out how to change the destination of this huge amount of ammunition. Instead of it going to Uganda or UAE, put them to the back of the line and divert it to Ukraine. And I think this is where governments can protect the liability of companies in Europe.
Now, that's a really interesting argument. Carlo, have you heard this before? What do you make of redirecting ammunition from places like Africa
Well, I
to
was
Ukraine?
always in favor of prioritizing the own national armed forces and Ukraine in whatever you produce. Unfortunately, we're a free market economy, so companies do work differently. But I fully agree with what Ben said. I mean, now it's time to give political orders, basically, to the market that there are two priorities, which are your own armed forces or European armed forces, to put it that way, and then Ukraine. And everything else is at best secondary as a market.
So speaking of private providers, let's talk about Starlink, Elon Musk's internet services. Sarah, what would happen if the U.S. were to cut Ukraine's access to Starlink, as the Americans have apparently threatened to do?
That would be something that would have immediate effect on the battlefield. Unlike, for example, if you stop military supply, which only unfolds impact maybe in 2 to 3 months, or a bit earlier, a bit later, depending on the concrete military capability. That would be something where you would feel it basically the same day on the battlefield when it comes to directing, scanning, for example, for drones, for finding Russian targets, also for protecting Ukrainian possible targets. And I think that also is something that will be really hard for Europeans to compensate for, because you would not only need a lot more satellites up in space, you would also need the capabilities to put these satellites up in space, and that's something that Europe is lacking at the moment. So that would be some example where you can really see, how long the cycles for arming and for building up defense capabilities are, because you would need to build up these space capabilities and then put satellites in space, and then put Ukrainians or help Ukrainians compensate for the loss of Starlink.
So let's pick up on those European efforts to find unity on this issue. We've had European leaders meeting in London and Paris, and they have been clear that they will need to boost their own defense and speak with one voice. But a lingering question remains: how to pay for it?
We stand with Ukraine. Europe is united. These and other words of assurance could be heard in London. But the facts on the ground make it hard to remain optimistic. At present, Europe is hardly in the position to defend itself, experts say. The President of the European Commission had an urgent appeal on Tuesday.
The real question in front of us is whether Europe is prepared to act as decisively as the situation dictates.
Without US support, Europe will need another 300,000 soldiers and 250 billion euros per year. Another problem is that various weapon systems across the continents are incompatible. Should the US military withdraw, Europe would also lose important capabilities like command chains for large military units. They'll also have to do without large transport aircraft, space satellites for intelligence purposes, and precision weapons. Nuclear deterrence is another gaping hole. Is Europe even ready for decisive action?
So So turning our focus to the future of European security. Ben, first of all, I'd like to just put into perspective how bad the current situation is. For example, if you were to look at a worst-case scenario, perhaps Russia deciding next week to roll into one of the Baltic states, to go into Lithuania, would the U.S. defend it as per its NATO obligations?
Well, certainly, I'm 66 years old. I've never in my life did I ever imagine that there would be a question that the United States would not live up to its Article 5 obligations as a member of NATO. But last week, when Prime Minister Starmer was in the Oval Office and the president was asked, do you still believe in Article 5? And the president hesitated for a second, then he kind of waffled. I mean, this is the easiest yes answer any president could ever give. So when he hesitated and started to caveat a little bit, that also creates doubt and worry in the minds of our allies, but also it signals to the Russians that it kind of erodes that deterrent effect. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I think we should keep in mind that Russia is not about to roll into a Baltic country. They cannot knock out Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has stopped Russia. This is not the grandfathers of these Russian soldiers today, would have broken through, would have overrun defenders, would have moved all the way to the Dnipro. Russian army today does not have that capability. They don't have the logistics. They don't have the mobile forces. They don't have the trained formations that can actually do that. So the most important thing to help protect Europe right now is to help Ukraine defeat Russia. So be pushing capability, be pushing things to them, while simultaneously doing exactly what we're seeing from most European armies, is to improve capability. Your depressing little video clip there was accurate, that of course Europe does not have the nuclear deterrent that the United States provides, although I think the French and the British are prepared to do things to extend that more. And then the transport. This has long been a vulnerability for Europe. There's the ability to move not just with big aircraft, but to move rapidly by rail. This is something that needs more than talk. Mm-hmm.
It does seem like the Zelensky-Trump meeting has been a real wake-up call, another wake-up call for Europe this time, we should say. And we've seen leaders now discussing huge sums of money, which not that long ago would have been really unthinkable. We've EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen saying Europe's ready to massively boost defense spending. And she's come up with a plan called Rearm Europe, proposing mobilizing close to 800 billion euros. Carlo, is that enough to do what they want?
Well, it depends what you want to purchase for this 800 billion. If you want to buy the right things, if you want to produce the right things, that's enough. If you handle it badly in a European way, that means that at the end of the day we still have to give money to 15 tank companies to build new tanks. Then it won't be enough, and it won't be effectively spent. So it's not a question of money. It's a question of political will. It's a question of money, but it's a question then of strategy. How do you want to spend the money? And we need to bridge. We need to take this next step to break it down into concrete actions, which also means consolidating the European defense industry, which is in part completely scattered and therefore ineffective.
That's another major issue, right? The fragmentation of different countries' European defense. How challenging will it be to try and find united defense systems for Europe?
I think it's a political question whether you want to treat defense industry as a national industrial policy where you want to keep jobs in your specific country, or you realize that it's about a European defense industry and then certain things are possible. I mean, decades ago, we basically created a German-French company, which is Airbus nowadays. So this is probably not the best example how you should do it, but at least it's an example that you can Europeanize it in a much better way than it's currently being handled.
Yeah, it's a European success story. Sarah, how do you see this? Is Europe finally finding the political willpower to unify on defense?
I mean, diamonds are created under immense pressure, so maybe this time pressure is high enough to finally form a European defense diamond, we'll say. But I share the viewpoint of Carlo, because I think we have, on the one side, we have the challenge to create a European defense system, defense capabilities. But on the other hand, we also face, on the national level, defense industry and a defense bureaucracy that is way too big, way too complicated, and way too inefficient. And I think that will be like a huge challenge for the upcoming defense minister, whoever is going to be, to not only, take the money and purchase something, but also to take the money and do it in an efficient way and to reform the bureaucracy in the defense system in Germany.
Yeah, perhaps you could just tell us a bit more about the Germans' efforts here. Yeah.
Well,
please,
we
Carlo.
don't know about the Germans' efforts. I mean, at least what we got yesterday is that basically, we will use the bazooka to make our armed forces better equipped. But I fully share what Sarah said. If I were Minister of Defense, for this money, I will put up a separate structure. Because if you put, regardless how many hundreds of billions of euros on a partly dysfunctional system, this won't make the system better. And it will overburden the system too. So I would create an own separate, leaner, smaller procurement structure designed to spend this additional money, which will come in with the new government.
And Ben, if you were a defense minister, what would be on your list? What would be your priorities for what needs to get done first?
Well, the first thing I would do is hire Sarah and Carlo to be my assistants.
Your second move, then.
The priority for any defense minister has got to be readiness, Einsatzbereitschaft, that your armed forces that you have got to be ready to do their job. This, to me, is even more important than purchasing new equipment, but making sure that what you have is functional, that all of your units are filled with soldiers, that they are training, that they have adequate fuel and ammunition and maintenance and repair parts, and that you exercise. This is very expensive. So it's not just about buying new equipment, but it's about making sure that the German or all of our Army, Navy, and Air Forces are capable to do what they have to do. That's the immediate priority, and it should be the priority for every defense minister.
And Carlo, what would your recommendation be?
Well, I would hire Ben as an assistant and special advisor. In addition to what he said, I think one of the things we need to talk about in Germany is personnel.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We have a gap right now, about 25,000 soldiers lacking. This gap will increase by June when NATO's capability requirements are going to be approved, up to, I think, 240,000 men and women. So we still have around 180,000. We need to get back to into a new form of conscription system. Like the Swedes do have, because otherwise this shows the last decade we are not able to fill the number of people, to get the number of people we need in the German armed forces. So this needs to be a priority, because at the end of the day you might have the best equipped German Bundeswehr ever in its history without people being able to fly the planes and to drive the tanks.
And Sarah, how politically realistic would that be in a place like Germany? Would something like conscription be possible? Is there the public sentiment behind it?
We're having basically the debate since we abandoned conscription more than 10 years ago. And I think that would be a moment in time with this immense pressure from the geopolitical situation and from what Russia, or how Russia threatens Europe. I think that that would be possible. But I think that brings me to something that, a possible defense minister should also do, because of course he or she, probably he, will have to implement policy decisions. But he will also be responsible for communicating that to a German public that has been reluctant to accept military and security realities for the past decades. And I think that will be a delicate balancing act to communicate that wisely and to really implement policy decisions rapidly.
Yeah. And Ben, who do you see taking the lead in Europe here? Is it Germany, the UK, France, Poland, all of them together?
Well, if I may first, something that Sarah just said
Please.
is exactly right, that our leaders have to speak to the population as if they are adults, explain what is at stake, why this matters. And my experience, I live in Frankfurt, my experience the last many years has been that most Germans, if they believe they're being told the truth and spoken to as adults, that people will accept responsibility that they have to do something. I think that's true in most of our countries. If the leader says, yes, this is going to be expensive, yes, you may have to reduce the amount of time you spend down in Kitzbühel or Wengen, but this is about our security and our future. So I think people will be willing to accept that. Clearly, Germany has to be the leader. That doesn't mean that you have to be out there waving a flag saying, we're the leader, follow us, but lead by example. And I think Germany can do that.
Well, we'll have that be the final word. Thank you so much to our fantastic panel for the insights today. We've been speaking with Carlo Masala, Sarah Pagung, and Ben Hodges. If you are watching on YouTube, leave us a comment, let us know what you thought, and hope to see you next time.